thank you very much, and very interesting to listen to that last presentation on inspection in particular. Something I will deal with in my presentation. But this morning, I'm going to do something which many of the previous speakers said I shouldn't do, which is I'm going to try and extract high-level lessons from the comparison of different systems. It is right that we should say, as researchers, we're worried about drawing conclusions on the basis of international comparisons. We're worried about drawing conclusions from this study of these limited dimensions of a system. That's absolutely right. But the discourse amongst policymakers and the discourse amongst politicians is a discourse of action, of trying to guide their actions to improve systems. So, despite our reservations as researchers, we have to try and bridge between the detail of limited studies and necessary action at a national and domestic level. So this is quite risky, and as I move through different countries, colleagues who have spoken already may become uneasy. I think that's inevitable. But nonetheless, let's go for it. There are three things that I'm going to really focus on, which are actually my conclusions. But I hope that you will be able to see that I've drawn these conclusions from very detailed analysis, collaborative work with other researchers, from the study of different countries. These are the three things, and they focus on strategic management. Firstly, the evidence base for action. So around this evidence base, we have to think about how policy is formed and the consensus in society for that policy. So evidence, the evidence base for action, that's the first thing. The second thing is high fidelity implementation. You can have a great policy as a politician, but if nobody does anything in schools to make that a reality in the school or the classroom, it's not really a policy. So we have to think about high fidelity implementation. And as part of that, the fine-tuning by policymakers of the policy, the evaluation of what's happening, quite fast as well as long term, and whether we've got high compliance. So whether we have a high compliance profession, whether we have high compliance across society. That's the second thing. So the first thing, evidence base. The second, high fidelity implementation. The third, 5 years ago, I would probably have said school autonomy. But I've been discussing this with Harry. I think it's probably the wrong way of looking at it. The way I like to look at it is through the high proximity of policy and practice. Now, I think that encapsulates ideas of autonomy. So we've got evidence for policy, high fidelity implementation, and high proximity between policy and practice. And I think we heard some of that from Estonia yesterday. Now, Estonia says that its schools have high autonomy. But there's also very strong dialogue between the schools and the municipality. Now that dialogue is important. If you want to do something innovative, you need to discuss it with the municipality. The municipality then understands the school in detail. Now I think this process can be explained through this concept of high proximity between policy and practice. when I presented recently in Estonia at a school conference, the minister was there. I mean, being asked tough questions about the future of the profession, tough questions about curriculum and assessment. There was really high proximity between the centre and the periphery. All in a system where people say, yes, we have high autonomy as schools. So I don't think the concept of autonomy is useful for describing those relationships. So, evidence-based for policy, high fidelity implementation, high proximity. Those are the concepts I'm going to look at and the conclusions I will reach. I'm going to look at Finland, Sweden, Singapore, England, Scotland, and Estonia, and I will be going quickly. Now, I think it's also useful to look at Japan, because it's a very big system and has some... Yeah, it's okay. They'll come. They'll come, don't worry, but they'll come fast. It's valuable to look at Japan. I'm not going to look at it today, but it's big. It's very interesting as a system. South Korea also is interesting, very big system. Portugal, I'm not going to go into detail because you know about Portugal. But it was interesting to look at because you were an improver. Poland, interesting to look at. It was an improver, not anymore. Austria, very important to look at for its vocational system. Switzerland, very few people look at. Again, very interesting in terms of its attainment both in academic but particularly in vocational. But today I'm going to look at Finland, Sweden, Singapore, England, Scotland, and Estonia. So I am interested in Portugal, and I'm very interested in the relationship between policy changes, which Raul put up, and performance. And these are the data about retention following the introduction of grade testing. Very interesting in terms of the sequence of and the time lags and the timing of improvement and effect of policy. But I'm not going to look at that. What should we look at? What should we be looking for in systems? I believe we particularly need to be looking at attainment, of course. Are things improving? But we need to look at that in conjunction with equity. And that's why Eric Hanushek's work is so important. As a liberal economist, he nonetheless is very interested in systems which secure both high attainment and high equity. What should we be looking for when we think about strategic management of systems? We should be looking for sustained improvement and be able to link them back to the actions that were taken. Because if we can't do that, it's just a mystery. It's like magic. Things are happening, but we don't know why. That's not very helpful for policymakers. But we should be looking at other things as well. It's beginning to look quite multidimensional in the way in which we heard from an economic perspective. We need to be looking at between school and within school variation. These are quite diagnostic of the performance of education systems. Equity across the pupil population in terms of ethnicity and social background. Now, we should be looking for those, and that's what I look for when I compare countries. But a very important framework for understanding the performance of systems over time are these two concepts, which come from Bill Schmidt and Richard Prowat's work and have been elaborated by work that I've done in conjunction with Bill. Bill asked, well, what do all these diverse systems have in common? Systems which seemingly on the surface are different, big, small, selective, non-selective. And the answer is that the high-performing systems do have one thing in common, which is they have curriculum coherence. And there are two dimensions of curriculum coherence. One is that they have coherence between instruction, assessment, aims and content of the curriculum. And you can see in some systems these things pull in different directions. The second understanding of coherence is that subjects are taught in rational sequences. So they have well-evidenced progressive frameworks in each subject. So there are two concepts of curriculum coherence that we need to pay attention to. Then there is, well, how do you achieve coherence? And so Bill and Richard looked at the forms of curriculum control in these nations. If you want coherence, how do you secure it? And these will come out of the narratives. This idea will come out of the narratives of the different nations that I will go on to. Now, for my own analysis, I've elaborated the idea of curriculum coherence, and I did it in conjunction with 3 or 4 discussions with Bill Schmidt, and I extended the idea of coherence, everything pulling in the same direction, across the things that policymakers can control. So they range from curriculum content, indeed, to inspection, and allied social measures like housing policy and social benefit. If those all line up, then you tend to have high-performing systems. And you can see how, I'll just give you one illustration of how they can pull in a different direction. If you have a national curriculum which emphasizes breadth and balance across a range of subjects, but then your assessment at the age of 11 focuses only on maths, literacy, and science, then you can get curriculum narrowing in the final years of primary education. So you have curriculum incoherence. And that's what happened in England. Now, I have a lecture which goes on for an hour on just those. I won't. It's just to show you what you need to look at and whether they line up in different nations. Oh, you're saying, well, what about history? Well, yes, there are also explanatory factors. You can't change the culture that you have now. You can't retrospectively change it. In Iceland, you have limitations of where you can put your population, historical contingencies, and so on. If you want to understand a system, you have to look at those too, but they're not very easy to change. Many of these take a lot of time if you want to change social structure, signaling into schools from society and the economy. These are more difficult things about which to have policy. So these are things about policy that you can change. These are things that explain performance alongside those. If you have good strategic management in a system, you have to attend to all of those. You have to understand the impact of those. I warned Claire I'm going to be critical of OECD. I'm going to be critical at 3 points in this presentation about OECD. Now, the first point of criticism is around the evidence base for action, because I am going to draw these big lessons which are contestable from these different nations. And sometimes I just find it very odd, the things I hear. So the big drive towards inquiry-based learning in science. This is happening around the world. Education researchers, policymakers, inquiry-based education, really important. Yeah, but it's negatively correlated with outcomes in the OECD's own evidence. So why on earth are we pursuing it? I mean, and if we shouldn't just take this evidence, we should say, well, this contradicts what many people are doing, so let's try and understand that in more detail. I find this odd. Now, the second point of criticism of Finland, of OECD, is just Finland. I mean, Finland was never top of PISA. So it was just convenient. I mean, it's close. You can get to it using cheap airlines. Japan is far more interesting. but it's a long way away and they don't speak English. Now, let's just look at Finland very quickly. Those are the PISA data. It obviously participated in 2000, was a surprise performer both to the Finns and to other European and Nordic nations. It plateaued in 2006, and it has been on steep decline ever since. It had like many nations, including England, it was adversely affected by COVID. Some countries were not, like Singapore. But we can go back beyond 2000. And Gabriel Heller-Sauergren's done good work at integrating previous TIMSS data with the assessment of young people going into the military. And when you standardize all of these assessment data, including the data from the cohort studies, which were implemented during the initial implementation of the revised comprehensive education system in Finland, you get this curve. Now, here, this is what people were interested in. Why? It's a high performer, so obviously you go to Finland and you say, what are they doing in Finland? And that was what was promoted in many presentations about Finland. Yeah, but these kids are 15. So you should be interested in what they were doing here. And if it's declining here, what you're doing here and here looks as though it's resulting in decline. Now, those time lags were not taken into account in the narratives about Finland. What we should be really interested in is what they were doing here, because look at this improvement trajectory. And these are all assessments of adolescents around the age of 15 or slightly later, 17. Now this puts a completely different picture in our minds in relationship to Finnish educational performance. And what they were doing here was quite remarkable. They were transforming the system from a highly selective system to a fully comprehensive system, something about which many people in society in Finland were extremely concerned. What did the Finnish government do about education during that time? Well, the Finns describe it as the iron fist in the iron glove in terms of curriculum control. They wanted schools to genuinely move from selection to comprehensive education, and they knew there was a lot of societal resistance. They'd tried to do it after the Second World War, and there hadn't been social agreement about it. So when they implemented it here, they implemented it in the small schools in the north of Finland, and they could ensure fidelity of implementation. My key second point. In the context of high compliance teachers, high compliance because they valued their professional practice because of the duration of initial training. Again, this is just a different story. This is the most successful period of Finnish education. And at the time it was introduced through very high levels of curriculum control from the centre, but in the context of high social consensus about the evidence for change. Very different narrative. Where are they now? Declining. Strong dependence on legacy cultural commitment to reading and learning. 70% of kids can decode words before they enter formal education in Finland. The reading doesn't come from the school system, it comes from society. They moved from a selective to a fully comprehensive education in the 1950s onwards, and that was really impressive. They have low between school variation, but relatively high within school variation. Quite interesting to look at that. The gender gap in reading is one of the highest in PISA. Socioeconomic gap is widening. It's consistent with the average, but that's not great. 8.5% of foreigners residing in Finland, relatively low composition, but a high proportion of those emigrant students are poor performing. There are stresses in the urban school system in Finland. It really is a big deal. There's a lot of controversy about which school your kids go to in the big urban areas. This is an even bigger deal that actually the Finnish government doesn't like talking about. They closed 2,000 schools in the late 90s. And, hang on. In the late 90s, wow, what's going on? This isn't part of the narrative internationally about Finland. 2,000 schools, the population of Finland is about 5 million. The population of England, it's about 10 times that. So that's the equivalent of England closing 20,000 schools. You cannot say that closing 20,000 schools doesn't affect your education system. They've got now a very high commitment to 21st century skills and allied curriculum theory. They've transformed teacher training, but it remains a high compliance system. I think the Finns are heading to trouble because the evidence for the curriculum theory that they're pursuing is weak. Sweden, another very interesting country, very, very interesting in terms of its trajectory. Very worried about its decline. Interesting improvement in 2015, we heard about that. Significant decline during the COVID period, despite very low school closures, but again, massive societal disruption. I mean, people did die in Sweden. There was big societal and economic disruption. This is the graph that really caused a great deal of concern in Sweden. That because of the relaxation of central control, again, curriculum control, through standardized common testing and examinations, and a dependence on teacher grades in a system which was becoming increasingly weakly regulated from the center because of a particular commitment to the autonomy of schools, teacher grades, the outcomes improved. So the education system was improving, clearly, apart from the fact that at the same time it was declining in all international surveys. This is serious actually, grade inflation, declining underlying performance. They were right to be really, really concerned. What did they do? They toughened up on the proximity of government to schools, because that proximity had been really relaxed, not least because of decentralization of the 80s, marketization and the creation of a limited number of free schools in the 1990s. But people say, well, not every school was a free school. No, but the system was heavily marketized with the idea that parents would be mobilized to make choice on the basis of the quality of the school. So all schools were affected by the decentralization and marketization. Serious decline, but since then a gradual increase in restriction and control, increased signaling of quality of educational provision through inspection, reintroduction of national testing and increase in inspection. National testing, they are teacher marked, but they are national tests. Increasing the fine-tuning of municipal and state elements. So curriculum control is increasing in Sweden. And that increase of curriculum control through discussion, through negotiation with the municipalities, coincides with the period of recovery in Sweden. Heavy investment 2 years ago in school textbooks, paper-based textbooks. Interesting. Now, school textbooks are a principal instrument of curriculum control, not in a negative sense, but a positive sense. The sequencing of instruction, the nature of pedagogy, the form of didactics, those are signaled by high-quality textbooks. They've got to be high quality. And do they force teachers to do what they do minute by minute? No, because a teacher can go backwards and forwards through the textbook if they so choose. In Singapore, although there are state-approved textbooks, I've seen teachers go back to textbooks from earlier grades if they feel the students are weak in a particular idea. Lack of curriculum control explains this decline of performance in Sweden. More recently, Henriksson has talked about the curriculum principles being implicated in the decline, the role of knowledge in the curriculum, and the lack of specification of key concepts in disciplines as being the focus of learning. That I'll return to in a moment in Scotland. Singapore is a sustained high improver, and it just carries on improving. And it improved during COVID, despite very long periods of school closure. So, what about Singapore? Deliberately high proximity between schools and policy making. Now, people say, Singapore, it's highly autocratic. They tell schools what to do. That's just far too simplistic. Interestingly, there is a list published every year of the head teachers that the Singapore government is going to move. That's a really interesting list. I mean, the existence of it is interesting. It's published every year. What does this do? This signals to the population that the government cares about the quality of education in every school, and that it knows whether the principal is doing a good job or not. That's really interesting. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the very complex relationship between the centre and the periphery in Singapore. We talk about the extent to which education is in the press in England. It's massively in the press in Singapore. There are articles every day in the Straits Times about what's going on in education. There is a strong sense of national identity, high value of human capital, because in the 1950s, that was when Singapore grew. It has no natural resources. Its human capital is all it has, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. Relatively high between school variation and within school variation. They know that they have a quality problem, and they're on it all the year, every year. There are segregated routes. It is a selective system. But unlike many systems, they've attended to the quality of the vocational route, and they've really upped the quality of the polytechnics. Very high stakes assessment system. They're worried about the stress on primary school children. But they are looking increasingly at high investment in all routes to try and decrease that stress on individuals. It is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial system. And an American researcher at a big conference there said, well, I went to a school and there was no policy on integration. So, it's just ridiculous. There's all this talk about integration in Singapore. But when I asked the principal about the policy which the school had about integration, the principal said the school has no policy on integration. And I said, yeah, that's right. He said, well, what? That doesn't make any sense. So I said, no. The social policy, remember my list of control factors, allied social measures? No. The Singapore government controls the ethnic mix in the housing around the school, and you have to go to your local school. This research was just looking in the wrong place for the integration policy. There are well-developed vocational routes, highly successful polytechnic system, highly structured model linking the educational system to the economy in terms of planning and investment, highly committed to 21st century skills in all the policy statements, but that's an illusion because it's a very balanced model underneath. The national curriculum, and more importantly, the state-approved textbooks have exactly what Bill Schmitz describes as curriculum coherence in terms of the sequencing within subjects. High level of research and innovation in all aspects of the system. Now, England is an improver. About 5 more minutes now. And very heavy investment in education during the 1990s, stagnation up to 2015, and improvement from 2010 in relationship to reading and mathematics in PISA, which can be traced back to the key ideas of highly evidence-based interventions with high fidelity. And the national curriculum doesn't the new national curriculum, which I was involved in, implemented in 2014, doesn't explain this improvement. The timings just don't coincide. What does coincide are these highly targeted interventions in maths, Shanghai Exchange, and reading programs based on phonics, building on previous strategies, but excluding the approaches within those strategies which didn't work, quite affected by COVID. Incredibly diverse system, really big, highly localized education markets, massive investment in the 90s, massification of higher education, shifts of patterns of governance in schools, strong influence of assessment, but very high quality data. We know what's going on in the system. Strong influence of school inspections, as we've heard, revised national curriculum in 2014, a knowledge-based model, but actually the key initiatives in reading and mathematics, high fidelity, high compliance, raised attainment. These high control interventions are linked to higher performance. We've got big impact of teacher shortages, and I'll finish on that in a moment. Poor transition between primary and secondary. Previously underdeveloped vocational arrangements, but commitment to the apprenticeship model and numbers are improving, and parents are beginning to prefer the apprenticeship model over higher education in some cases and some localities. Now, interesting, Scotland and England are connected geographically, very similar economy, very similar social structure. England is improving, Scotland is tanking. The standards are going down and down and down. Protracted decline since a new curriculum was implemented in 2010. More rapid drop than the OECD average in COVID. England, although it declined much less than Scotland. What's happening in Scotland? Previously a very high performer. It's got a challenging distribution of schools, many small schools in remote places. Very similar to the Nordic countries. It previously had impressive equity in higher education. Very strong working class commitment to education. That's the route out of poverty. Pressure for education to improve because of some diversity in outcomes. Increased school autonomy alongside a focus on reduced class size. But I just couldn't understand what was going on, because there was a new curriculum which downgraded knowledge, emphasized rich learning experiences, strongly endorsed the third and final criticism of OECD, strongly endorsed by OECD, really implicated in the decline in Scotland. So my first point, you need an evidence-based policy. The evidence is very weak in relationship to this particular curriculum, and it shows in the outcomes. What's also important is there's been an underlying process of concentration of power at the centre, and that's that Walter Hume's very good work at Stirling, but a weakening of the proximity of policy making to the reality of what's going on in schools. What was the reaction of the centre to teachers saying, we don't know what to teach? What the centre said, you're not understanding our policy. Just one more push. You need to try harder. Very low proximity in my view. To finish, Estonia, fascinating place. It's absolutely tiny. Now, I mean, this is very important in terms of proximity. It's a top-performing European nation, strong sense of national identity, and that was really strongly emphasized over our discussion last night at dinner. Really strong sense of national identity and high value of human capital. Very close proximity. The minister listens to the teachers hear what the minister thinks. They discuss it. It's so close. It has previously had very stressed primary school arrangements, just not enough places. But that's linked to a very strong learning culture in families. Very high compliance system, very, very strong user of textbooks in the past, very well written national curriculum until recently, where it's become vague, and I don't know why. I don't know why you're going down that route, by the way. But you can still see the residue effect of that. High levels of detailed regulation, high use of ed tech, regular checking of program. Again, proximity. All that data is online. A parent can just look at how the school's doing, as well as how their child is doing. Very interesting feedback into a model of personalized learning, but it's a very particular model of personalized learning, which is that we do care for each child and we understand how they're doing, but that doesn't mean every child is pursuing a different route at a different pace in the school. Far from it. Now moving to low prescription national curriculum from a legacy high demand curriculum. You really need to watch Estonia, I think, because I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do. And it's got a decline in science, which I think we need to understand. So to finish, this is the last slide. I've talked about evidence, I've talked about high fidelity, I've talked about high proximity, and I do think that those three ideas explain a lot about these systems. I've talked about curriculum coherence, how everything should line up and not pull professionals in different directions. Nor give teachers too many things to do. That's very clearly what's happening in Scotland. The amount of curriculum development done at the school level is incredibly high in Scotland. The curriculum models have to be right. There has to be evidence-based content and evidence-based pedagogy and didactics. Proximal relations, in terms of schools and central policy, vital. There has to be data available to see how things are going and whether a policy works or not. And Portugal knows this, continuity is quite helpful. Combined with appropriate evaluation and fine-tuning. Not, that wasn't working, let's abandon it and do something else. Valid forms of personalised learning, as I implied with Estonia. Attention to both the specific and general goods of education. Of course we need to worry about the general goods. Are kids experiencing well-being? Are they being attended to as individuals? Those are important general goods of education. But also, do they understand conservation of mass and the idea of the human unconscious, the specific goods? And how is the school located in the community? Well, at the time that Finland had all those small schools, there was huge proximity between the curriculum making in the school and the local community. And one study said it brilliantly. The teacher said, I've taught in this school for 30 years, and if I don't teach Sven to read, his mother will shout at me in the post office. Finally, we do have population changes. We have, of course, economic shifts, and we have climate change, which will instigate massive migration of people from where they are being schooled now to being schooled somewhere else. We have COVID impact, which Harry will talk about, being still there in systems, and it doesn't clear the system until 2030. Kids were born during pandemic and suffered deprivation cognitively and socially as a result. I hope that I've shown you there are some misconceptions about high-performing systems. There are myths and legend. I talk about Finnish fairy stories. They're not real and they're not true. And perhaps the last thing we need to worry about, all of us, is that we are running out of teachers. They are getting older, and we are asking them to do more things. And that, for me, is one of the biggest risks in relationship to the quality which I've been describing. I hope that that's been helpful, and many of the things I've said, I hope will stimulate argument and disagreement, but we have to try and join up what we are learning about the detail with these high-level models that we bring to policy making. Thank you very much indeed.